The illusion you cherish most is the one you never question. Look around you. The freedom you believe you possess, was it truly your choice or simply the most elegant form of control ever devised? Democracy, that sacred ideal we defend with religious fervor, harbors a contradiction so fundamental that acknowledging it threatens the very foundations of our social order. Welcome to Eyes of Power. Today we explore democracy's darkest paradox. Its survival depends on the very manipulation it claims to reject. The buildings of power stand tall and imposing against the skyline of any capital city. Marble columns, grand domes, flags, waving in calculated patterns, all designed to make you feel something without telling you you're being made to feel it. This architectural psychology mirrors the larger system it houses. Democracy isn't simply about counting votes. It's about manufacturing the minds that cast them. Consider the last time you felt absolutely certain about a political position. That certainty, that emotional conviction, where did it come from? If you trace it back, you'll find the fingerprints of manipulation so subtle you mistook them for your own thoughts. This isn't conspiracy, this is function. Throughout human history, pure democracy has never existed without mechanisms of social control. Ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy, limited voting rights to property-owning men and employed sophisticated rhetoric to maintain social order. The Founding Fathers of America designed a republic specifically to filter and moderate the public will. Even today, every democratic nation employs calculated information management, from education curricula to media regulations, all while maintaining the narrative that public opinion forms naturally and independently. The uncomfortable truth is this: unmanaged democracy contains the seeds of its own destruction. Without boundaries and guidance, democratic systems naturally deteriorate into either mob rule or paralysis. The psychological tendency of groups to polarize, the vulnerability of masses to emotional contagion, the cognitive limitations that make direct democracy impractical at scale. These aren't bugs in the system. They're features of human psychology that democratic systems must account for to survive. Consider Brexit, a profound democratic moment that revealed democracy's central contradiction. The public was asked to vote on an immensely complex geopolitical decision with multi-generational consequences. The same public that studies show couldn't explain the basic function of the EU. Was this true democracy, or was it something else? The campaigns on both sides employed emotional manipulation rather than rational discourse because they understood a fundamental truth. Reason doesn't drive democratic choice. Emotion does. The architects of modern democracy understood this. Walter Lippmann, one of the most influential political thinkers of the 20th century, wrote explicitly about the manufacture of consent, the necessity of guiding public opinion in democratic systems. Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, argued that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. These weren't the words of tyrants. They were the insights of those who sought to make democracy functional. The silence around this topic isn't accidental. Democratic societies maintain a careful narrative that citizen choice is sovereign and organic, while simultaneously developing increasingly sophisticated methods of influencing those choices. Political campaigns don't simply present information, they target your psychological vulnerabilities, your identity needs, your fears and aspirations. They understand that your political positions aren't primarily rational, they're expressions of who you believe yourself to be. Look at how modern campaigns micro-target voters. They don't just know your demographics, they know your psychological profile. They know which emotional triggers will activate your identity, which fears will motivate you to vote, which language patterns will bypass your rational filters. This isn't corruption of democracy, this is democracy operating as it must to maintain stability. The digital landscape has only intensified this reality. The algorithms that determine what information reaches you don't simply reflect your preferences, they shape them. Each click, each view, each engagement deepens the psychological profile that allows the system to predict and influence your next move. When you feel outrage at a political headline, that emotion isn't just yours. It's a cultivated response, designed to keep you engaged, to reinforce your identity, to maintain your place in the democratic ecosystem. Consider how your news feed shapes your understanding of reality. The stories you see aren't random. They're selected by algorithms designed to maximize your engagement. The emotional valence of the stories isn't accidental. It's calibrated to keep you responding. Your perception of what matters, what's urgent, what's true, all of this is gently guided by systems operating beneath your awareness. This isn't a conspiracy. It's simply the mechanism by which modern democratic information systems function. The paradox deepens when we examine how democratic societies handle crisis. When faced with genuine threats, economic collapse, pandemic, war, democratic governments don't simply present all information neutrally and trust citizen judgment. They craft narratives, emphasize certain facts over others, appeal to emotion rather than reason, not because they're corrupt, but because they understand that unfiltered information leads not to wisdom, but to panic, polarization, and paralysis. During the COVID-19 pandemic, democratic governments didn't present the full complexity of scientific uncertainty. They created simple, actionable messages. They emphasized certain risks and downplayed others. They used psychological techniques to promote compliance with public health measures. Was this manipulation? Absolutely. Was it necessary for democratic societies to function during crisis? History suggests it was. This management of citizen perception extends to the very foundation of democratic stability, the economy. Central banks don't announce all deliberations. They carefully craft communications to influence market psychology. Government economic reports emphasize certain metrics while downplaying others. Financial regulations aren't simply technical, they're psychological, designed to create confidence, manage expectations, prevent panic. The democratic citizen isn't trusted with the full complexity of economic reality because markets require psychological management to function. The philosophical implications are profound. Democracy rests on the ideal of informed consent, citizens making reasoned choices based on full information. Yet democratic systems consistently operate on the understanding that human reason is limited, that information must be curated, that choice must be structured. The tension between democratic ideals and democratic practice isn't a failure, it's a necessary accommodation to human psychology. Consider political leadership itself. Democratic societies claim to want authentic, honest leaders. Yet successful democratic politicians are masters of strategic authenticity, revealing certain aspects of themselves while carefully concealing others. They understand that governance requires maintaining certain fictions, managing certain perceptions, crafting certain narratives that may not be strictly true but are necessary for social function. When Franklin Roosevelt concealed the extent of his disability, when John F. Kennedy hid his health problems, when modern leaders present simplified solutions to complex problems, they weren't simply being deceptive. They were engaging in the necessary theater of democratic leadership. The uncomfortable truth is that pure transparency is incompatible with effective governance in mass democracies. The moral question becomes not whether manipulation exists in democracy, but what kind of manipulation best serves democratic values. If some degree of public opinion management is inevitable, what principles should guide it? If citizen choice is always influenced, how do we ensure that influence aligns with broader democratic goods rather than narrow interests? The most dangerous manipulation in democracy isn't the kind we can see. It's the manipulation that remains invisible, that presents itself as natural, that operates without accountability. The solution isn't to eliminate influence, an impossible goal, but to make influence transparent, to create systems where manipulative techniques cancel each other out through competition, to educate citizens not just about issues, but about the psychological techniques used to shape their understanding of those issues. Consider how differently we might approach democratic discourse if we acknowledge this reality. Instead of the naive view that more information leads to better democratic outcomes, we might focus on creating information environments that account for human psychology. Instead of condemning all influence as corruption, we might distinguish between manipulation that empowers citizens and manipulation that exploits them. The deepest irony is that democracy's greatest strength, its ability to adapt and evolve, depends on the very manipulation it officially rejects. Democratic systems must shape citizen perception enough to maintain stability, but not so much that citizens lose their capacity for genuine choice. This balance between guidance and freedom, between influence and autonomy, is the true art of democratic governance. Think about how education functions in democratic societies. We don't simply present children with all possible viewpoints and let them choose. We carefully curate information. We emphasize certain values. We shape developing minds toward democratic norms. This isn't indoctrination, we tell ourselves, it's citizenship formation. Yet it relies on the same psychological techniques that, in other contexts, we might call propaganda. The management of democratic perception extends to national identity itself. Democratic nations maintain careful narratives about their own history, emphasizing certain events while downplaying others, creating founding myths that unite citizens around shared values. These narratives aren't simply true or false, they're functional, designed to create the psychological conditions necessary for democratic cooperation. When America tells itself stories about freedom and opportunity while downplaying histories of slavery and genocide, when European democracies emphasize Enlightenment values while minimizing colonial atrocities, they aren't simply lying. They're engaging in the narrative management necessary for democratic function. The alternative, a completely unfiltered reckoning with historical complexity, might satisfy intellectual honesty but could undermine the shared identity that democracy requires. The question isn't whether these manipulations exist, but whether we can create systems where they check and balance each other, where no single narrative dominates, where citizens maintain enough critical distance to participate in their own influence. The democratic citizen isn't one who escapes manipulation, an impossible goal, but one who understands the manipulations at play and maintains the capacity to choose between competing influences. This understanding transforms how we might approach democratic reform. Instead of the naive view that we can eliminate manipulation from democratic systems, we might focus on making manipulation transparent, on creating systems where manipulative techniques cancel each other out through competition, on educating citizens not just about issues, but about the psychological techniques used to shape their understanding of those issues. The democratic paradox can't be resolved. It can only be managed. The tension between the ideal of fully autonomous citizen choice and the reality of psychological influence isn't a failure of democracy. It's a necessary accommodation to human nature. The question isn't whether manipulation will exist in democratic systems, but what kinds of manipulation best serve democratic values. Perhaps the most disturbing implication is that democracy requires certain fictions to function, not just practical fictions about how policies will work, but deeper fictions about the nature of democracy itself. The fiction that public opinion forms naturally rather than through influence. The fiction that leaders follow public will rather than shape it. The fiction that democratic citizens are primarily rational rather than emotional in their political choices. These fictions aren't lies in the conventional sense. They're functional narratives that create the psychological conditions necessary for democratic participation. Without them, citizens might become too cynical to engage, too aware of their own manipulation to consent to governance, too conscious of democratic contradictions to participate in democratic processes. The alternative to managed democracy isn't pure democracy, it's either authoritarianism or chaos. Human societies require coordination, narrative, and psychological management to function at scale. The democratic innovation isn't eliminating these requirements, but distributing them, creating systems where influence competes with influence, where manipulation checks manipulation, where no single narrative can dominate without challenge. The path forward isn't to eliminate influence from democratic systems, an impossible goal, but to create information environments that account for human psychology while respecting human dignity. To distinguish between manipulation that empowers citizens and manipulation that exploits them. To build democratic systems that acknowledge human irrationality without surrendering to it. This understanding doesn't devalue democracy. It places democracy in its proper context as a sophisticated system for managing human psychology in service of human freedom. The democratic citizen isn't one who escapes manipulation, but one who understands the manipulations at play and maintains the capacity to choose between competing influences. As you navigate your own democratic participation, consider not just what you believe, but how you came to believe it, not just who you support, but how that support was cultivated, not just what information reaches you, but the systems that determine what information feels relevant, urgent, and true. The most dangerous manipulation isn't the kind you disagree with. It's the kind that feels natural, the kind that aligns so perfectly with your identity that questioning it feels like questioning yourself. True democratic freedom begins not with the absence of influence, but with the awareness of how influence operates on your own mind. The democratic paradox remains. Democracy requires the very manipulation it claims to reject. But understanding this paradox doesn't diminish democracy. It reveals democracy's true sophistication as a system for managing human psychology in service of human freedom. The question isn't whether manipulation exists in democratic systems, but what kinds of manipulation best serve democratic values. If this perspective has opened your eyes, subscribe to Eyes of Power. The manipulations that shape your world work best when they remain invisible. By making them visible, we don't weaken democracy, we strengthen it. Comment perception if you're beginning to see the system beneath the system. And remember, in a world of influence, the most dangerous position is believing you're immune to it. Until next time, this is Eyes of Power.